And a lot of times when you're sharing your vision with people and you have to be careful who you share your vision, and it's like, you are the one that has to believe your vision. Hey, Tanya. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Of course.
I truly appreciate it. So, recently here, I've been starting out with, because I'm into birthdays and zodiac signs.
Yep.
So, you told me you were born on April 4th.
I was.
That makes you an unfortunate Aries. Aries.
I'm sorry, unfortunate. I love it. I love it.
But do you believe in signs?
A little bit. There are some times when I'm like, oh yeah, that's just me being a little combative. I'm an Aries, like, it happens.
Okay.
I do not shy away from confrontation. So there could be a little bit to the sign situation.
It could be a little
Yeah,
bit.
a little bit.
Okay, all right. You're married, right?
I am,
What's
yes.
your husband?
He is, he's a Gemini.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So,
But you guys have known each other since you were young, right?
Yes. And we've been married for over a decade. We've been together over 2 decades, which is kind of wild.
Okay.
I gave it 2 weeks, but it's fine.
You gave it 2 weeks.
I did.
Now you're into
I did.
2 decades.
Yeah. It's.
Well, you really thought that?
I did because I was young. I didn't know. It was like, all right, we just kind of kept hanging out. Still like him. We still hang out. It's a good time.
And then you just all of a sudden, here you are.
Exactly. Yeah,
I guess that's
exactly.
easy.
Right. It works out.
What does he do?
He's an architect as well.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yes.
How does that work out?
Well, he is very much a new construction architect.
Okay.
So he often sees historic buildings. He's like, no, just tear that down. What are you doing? So we have fun and lively conversations.
Sure.
But whenever we travel, it's fun because we can nerd out on the bricks and the architecture and the buildings. But he definitely wants to be the architect who's looking at the details of the new construction and how the steel and glass are going together. Whereas I'm kind of like, what's that going to look like in 50 years? Come on.
It'll just be another piece.
Exactly.
Have that historical.
Exactly. I'm just kind of like, well, maybe someone will want to preserve this in 50 years. Because that's the thing that I love about architecture and preservation is that preservation exists on a sliding scale. So buildings, particularly in the U.S., once they hit 50 years old, then they're eligible to be considered historic. And so everything that we are designing and building today will eventually one day be eligible to be historic. And so when I'm talking to my husband and other architects, it's like, are we designing things today that we want someone to fight to preserve in 50 years? Are we designing things that are going to have staying power, that are going to basically mean something in the future, as opposed to just be disposable and thrown away? Because sometimes some of the architecture that we're designing today is not, does not have the gravitas that some of the other architecture of older times did.
So what do you think would be, because it's so hard for me to look at what we build now versus what was built
Right.
100 years ago, right?
Yeah.
It's there was a lot more integrity to what was built then.
And a lot of it also came to technology because I think a lot of the buildings that were built before the invention of air conditioning.
Okay.
They had bigger windows, they needed to get light in, open the windows for ventilation, they had more overhangs. So there was a lot of design that went into those buildings because they had to work with the elements. As technology evolved, architects forgot a lot of things. And I think we're getting back to the point where we're paying attention more to building science. So buildings that are like passive house or designed to passive house standards or other really deep sustainable standards to have more resilience and be able to work with the current environment, I think will have more staying power than ones that are just designed to be code minimum, that are designed to kind of fill a very quick need, but not thinking about future resiliency.
Can you share what passive housing is
sure.
for people?
Yeah, that's fine. So passive house is a building performance standard. So it's one of many. So there's also LEED, which is the one that most people are familiar with. And that's leadership in energy and environmental design, I think is what that stands for. That one is very much like you have a checklist. Here are some things that you should put in your building. And then once you meet them, then you're good to go. LEED, there's not much, at least in this iteration, there isn't much verification. Passive house, on the other hand, there are a number of standards that you have to meet. So it's kind of like there's a certain amount of energy that can be used per person in the building. There's a certain number of airtightness that has to be met. And all of this is actually field verified and tested. So you have to do a blower door test, make sure you hit the air changes per hour. So it's a much more higher performing building because it's a verified performance system or rating system, as opposed to a, yes, I promise I will do this the way I say I'm going to do it. And so passive house buildings, they're a little bit of a higher standard of energy performance.
And would those kind of buildings be worthy of keeping 50 years later?
I hope so. And I think the way that building scientists and architects are talking to each other more, we're paying more attention to how we're constructing our buildings and what the environment is doing to it, how air is going, how it's impacting the occupants. I think the design of passive house buildings are also getting more aesthetically intriguing and aesthetically beautiful. When the system first came to the U.S. rather, a lot of the buildings were very boxy and unremarkable. But now they're now they're looking very.
I like how you slipped right in.
But now they're getting more elegant and it's very efficient and beautiful. So it's spaces that people actually want to be, as opposed to just being like, oh, that building looks dumpy. But now it's like, oh, that's a really beautiful building I want to be in. Oh, and it can withstand changes in the environment that are going to happen. And so that's one of the things that's super exciting for me.
Very cool. What made you, because like you said, your husband is into just straight construction. What drew you to historic preservation?
So I always saw architecture and preservation as the same thing, but I didn't realize that preservation was a separate field. So I grew up in Northern Virginia and was in DC a lot in the early 1990s.
Okay.
DC of the 1990s is not the same of DC of today.
No, it's not.
But I remember being confused as a child and be like, why am I seeing homeless people sleeping outside of vacant buildings? And so for me, I was like, all right, well, if we just made the buildings better so people could actually live in the buildings, they wouldn't be homeless. And so I got into architecture thinking that the building was the answer to the homelessness problem. Then I learned it was not. But going through architecture school, I remember thinking, after a couple of years in, I was like, so when do we start working with existing buildings? And architecture school is very much trying to teach you how to be a design thinker. So a lot of it's like, here's this blank site. What would you build there? And I was like, but we have all these existing buildings. When do we learn about that? And then I had... then that's when I was told, hey, that's historic preservation. That's a different field than architecture proper. I was like, oh, all right. So then we went and learned more.
Because you was waiting for that.
Right, exactly. I was like, when do we get to existing buildings? And I did have some historic preservation professors and learning more about that as like elective classes, but it wasn't a required class for the architecture program. So it was one of those things where having to go and find it on my own. So anyway, so the more I got into preservation, learning more about it. I also am very much into sustainability, and preservation is an inherently sustainable act because you're reusing what's already here. For those of us who were familiar with that 80s and 90s marketing push of reduce, reuse, recycle, I mean, it very much applies to architecture and historic preservation. If, reduce what you need. If you can't reduce it, at least reuse it. If you can't reuse it, at least recycle it. And so historic preservation and adaptive reuse definitely falls in that reusing cycle of it. And I mean, and they're ranked that way in that order because that's the way to do it. So I knew that I wanted to work with existing buildings, and architecture and preservation, sustainability all worked with that. And so then the more that I also got into it, I realized that I was very concerned also about working in neighborhoods and doing work for Black and brown folks as well. And so then the layer of race and gender also started impacting my work and understanding more of policy and how policy has impacted where different groups of people have been allowed to live, how much they've been able to work, and just all of the redlining and discrimination and all of the ridiculousness and injustices that have happened in the built environment and how all of that is related. And so preservation has really been the through line and kind of, in my mind, the silo breaker of being able to talk to architects as well as sustainability folks and policy, and just really a way to have a broader conversation and kind of get us out of some of our silos.
Nice. Usually when you go out to speak, what is the thing that you're really focused on when you go out to speak to people?
So it depends on the audience, but often it is, what do I want people to take away from it? When I first started speaking, I would just try and do like an information dump and just overwhelm people with all of the things. And I was like, oh, maybe that's not so helpful, because then it's like they can't suss it out. Whereas I see myself as someone who is operating at the intersections of a lot of these fields.
Okay.
Being able to kind of distill things down a little bit is something that I've been learning as I've been doing more speaking. And so one of the things, for instance, I recently spoke at Reimagine Buildings, which is something, or it was a conference that the Passive House Accelerator put on. And so one of the quotes that I used within that to try and help people in the sustainability and passive house world understand about how racism is impacting climate change. It's a great quote from Hop Hopkins, who used to be at the
Wait a
Sierra.
minute, how racism
Yes.
is impacting climate change.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. Right.
Help me.
Yeah. Right. And so this was, it was a great quote from Hop Hopkins, who used to be at the Sierra Club. And he has a quote that says, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. You can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism.
Wow.
And so it's like the idea that where certain waste gets put, whose voices get heard, all of that really is tied back to racism. And so how we can't be so focused on climate change that we're forgetting the human impacts of all of it. And so being able to make those connections and share what I'm learning with people in different silos.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been really excited about doing.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah, I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, please. I mean, I stole it from Hop.
No, I mean, but wow.
Yeah.
Just another layer.
Exactly.
Another layer.
Yeah.
So you said at 6 years old, you realized that, something in your mind clicked and said, I need to get into saving these buildings.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure at the time you didn't know it was architecture, but you knew it was something you needed to do to save these buildings.
Right.
And, they often say, that's why I asked for the picture between 7 and 14. They often say you figure out what your gift is or what you're supposed to be doing in those years.
Oh, interesting.
So
That makes sense, because I definitely was. I was taking drafting classes in high school. It's like learning how to use AutoCAD and all that, and it was great because my drafting teacher was a Black man, and I didn't realize that there weren't that many Black people in architecture because my first drafting teacher was a Black man. So it's like it was great to be able to start using architecture software in high school. So interesting, 7 to 14. Okay.
So you in that time, did anything else say, well, maybe should I really be doing did anything else creep into your mind that maybe you should be doing?
I thought at one point in time that I was like, you know what, maybe I will be a doctor. And then I was like, ooh, nope, I don't like blood. And then I was like, you know what, I'll be a vet. And then I was like, nope, still blood. So that's not going to work.
Right.
And so then I was like, you know what, let me, maybe I need to think more about this architecture side of it. Because I was like, all goes well. There's no blood in architecture. So that's the goal.
Got it. Did it flow easy for you when you started to do this work?
No. Because one of the things, so the architecture process and even the architecture culture in school and studio, as well as in the profession, it's a very critical process. And you have to be very vulnerable, because the whole, the way that it works is your studio professor will say, hey, here's the prompt. Let's say we're working on a site in New York and you need to make it into apartments, go. And so then you and your classmates are all trying to design your own building, trying to figure out what it's going to look like. And then you'll have a kind of studio crit. So, every week your professor would come and talk to you, look at your work, give you some suggestions. You'd have your mid-review pinups. And that's where everyone in your studio pins up their work. And then everyone gets about 10 to 15 minutes to present their work and then receive feedback from your professor and outside critics. And those were brutal a lot of times, because it would be like
it was brutal.
Yeah, because it's one of those things where there's always the range of really talented students and other ones who were still struggling. Some of the ideas were working, some of they weren't, but a lot of it was you're figuring it out as you go along. You're learning the tools. So architecture is not like math where 2 + 2 is going to equal 4. It's very much like, here's everything that it could be. What do you want it to be? And you have to decide and then try and get your idea on paper in a way that other people can understand it and then communicate that idea. And that's often the hard part, because you're like, no, in my mind I'm seeing it somewhere different, but I can't quite get it to show up the way I want it to show up on the paper. And then the conversation that I end up having about that with someone about the work I'm showing doesn't align with what's in my head. So it's a lot of having to make things make sense to be able to communicate it out.
So it's seeing it in your head. Mm-hmm. You need to put it on paper.
Right.
And you kind of discounted math early, because a lot of people feel like you got to know a lot of understanding of.
You don't. just saying the number of people I've met who be like, oh, I wanted to be an architect, but I wasn't good at math or science. That's okay. You know,
Really?
it's okay.
Because a lot of people feel like they need to be proficient at math, or otherwise, why waste my time? That's more on the engineering side, though, right?
Exactly. I mean, and one of the things, so architects, we hire engineers, and engineers figure out a lot of the things. I'm not saying that architects have to know code, we have to know a lot of things, but we don't have to solve formulas. I'm not using any calculus on a day-to-day basis. And undergrad, I had, to fulfill the architecture degree, I had to do 1 semester of calculus. I had to do some physics, making sure we understand how buildings, how structures work, at least conceptually, but we hire structural engineers to help us out. A lot of the architect is really, what's the form going to look like? How does it going to come together? And then we work with the team to figure out how to make it work in all the other ways it needs to work.
So that concept piece is really, the design concept piece is really the biggest piece, right?
Exactly.
And then fitting it into the boxes in terms of code and those kind of things.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
So I'm asking these questions out of order, but I have to.
That's okay.
So do you think that this is part of your purpose to be an architect? Or
I think so. And I think part of it is also architecture and architect as conductor, as silo breaker. Because I feel like one of the things that is interesting, because granted, a lot of people, when they think of architects or architecture, it's often the egotistical white male that comes to mind. It's often, the pompous, pretentious, oh my gosh, whatever. So I think it's helping people see architects differently. And mind you, there aren't that many Black architects. There are even fewer Black women architects. And so really trying to help people see that there are multiple ways to be. And the big reason I think this is part of my purpose is because for so long, the decision makers who have decided what buildings get built, where they get built, what they look like, who's allowed to do all of these things, have been white men, have been people who haven't had marginalized lives, who haven't considered how certain things will impact others, in most cases. And so I like being an architect, and I like being able to be in rooms with those decision makers to influence people to see things a little bit more broadly and to understand, well, hey, if we do this, this is how these people are going to be impacted, and this is why these people matter. And this is, if we're trying to solve this, we can't ignore that. And so I think a lot of it is making a lot of the connections and seeing all of the constraints. And so in that regard, I think my architecture education absolutely helped me with design thinking and seeing how multiple things relate. But I realized that sometimes architecture is more than just what's drawn or what's the aesthetic value of it. I feel like architects have a much bigger role to play. And when it comes to policy, I have a lot of good friends and architects in New York who are doing really amazing sustainable work, but they're also talking to their policymakers, because we're realizing that policymakers don't know what they don't know, particularly when it comes to building science and architecture and climate change. The number of policymakers who I've talked to, when I would start talking about existing buildings, I'm like, well, what do existing buildings have to do with climate change? All right, well, that's where we're starting from. Good to know. Okay. But it's like the operation of existing buildings account for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it's like, if we're not dealing with the existing buildings, that's a lot that we're missing out on. But it's like, if policymakers aren't understanding how everything is connected, then they're passing policies that aren't really going to be addressing the problem.
Right.
And so it's like realizing that we all need to share the knowledge that we have, because the people who are in the positions of power may not know what they don't know. And if we're not, if we're only operating in our own silo, then we're not going to get the information where it needs to be. Yeah.
That's sort of there's a lot of that going on in the world. When I think about just how the United States is run, all the people that work there, they have very little concept of how Congress, the president.
Right.
Most of those people have no concept of how the rest of the world lives.
Exactly.
So that's kind of parallel to what you're saying, is that a lot of the policymakers are making policy about things they really clearly can't understand.
Right.
So they can't really look at the whole picture and make a clear decision about what kind of policy should be.
Right.
I got it.
Yeah.
I love that. So my next question is who is Nakita Reed?
Oh, interesting. So I am someone who is passionate about sharing knowledge and making connections. I am I've always been kind of in the middle of things, I think, in terms of like, in high school, I was in the marching band, also a 4-year triathlete, and in student government. I had friends who were goths and jocks, and like I've always kind of been at the intersection of things.
Got it.
And so I'm a connector, kind of shorthand. Yeah.
What makes your soul sing? Like, if you could live today, what was la 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 la? Just what?
Yeah. I would love to be able to. So one of the things that I always think about and frustrates me is kind of this idea of shortage, when it's really not a shortage of food, a shortage of water. It's just disconnected systems to disseminate. I would love to be able to help get, water, that a surplus of water in this part of the world to the part of the world that needs it. Same with the food. I feel like there's so many things that are wasted that don't need to be, and they're only wasted because there's not the systems in place to actually be more efficient. And so I would love to be able to somehow be involved in making that
Connection.
Yeah, making those connections, easing some pain. Like I feel like there's so much pain that is man-made, that is unnecessary. And a lot of it comes to waste, and would love to be able to somehow help solve or be a part of making that change.
So I'm going to backtrack really quickly because I was thinking about you speaking, and it's predominantly, when you look out, it's predominantly men. And are they looking at you?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean?
I got you. So what's interesting? So one of the first keynotes I did, where it was like I was the keynote of the event, was for the American Institute of Architects DC chapter. It was for their like spring design DC thing. And so my mom came because she's like, "Oh, you're keynoting over here." I was like, "Oh, great." And so she walks in and she's like, "Huh, there's a lot of white men here." I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "It's architecture, Mom. Yes, it is a lot of white men." And then I leaned over to her, I was like, "And Mom, I'm about to talk about racism." And here we go. So it was a solid 45 minutes about why, or how architecture and racism and how it's all connected and all that. And it was pretty well received. There was one man who came up after, and it was interesting because I did have there were about 4 or 5 other Black women architects who were in the room, and when they saw this man come up, they all were like leaning forward a little bit, like, "Say something." Like I felt their support, but he very much came up and he was like, "Well, you've made something of yourself. Why can't you just tell others to do the same thing?" Like it was very much like he just missed the whole point of the talk.
It went right over his head.
And he didn't understand his point. So anyways, it was one of those things where it's having those conversations in mixed audiences is where I'm getting more comfortable, because I'm realizing I'm in a position where I have the opportunity to use my platform to have those conversations. And that's where those conversations are needed as well. Because, I workshop a lot of this with my homegirls, and even like at the National Organization of Minority Architects Conference and all that. But it's like there is a contingent of non-melanated folks who also need to hear what's happening.
Do you get the line at the end of the speech? Do people, you know how they come and talk to the keynote?
Yeah, I do. And I'm always surprised when I do, but it's super cool. Yeah.
That's really cool. Just for example, what are some of the questions that they may ask? I mean, because I'm just so curious to see predominantly white men coming up asking a Black woman who just gave a keynote.
Right. Yeah. So some of it is also, there have been some that come up that are also taking a more global view. And so they have questions about, have I thought about how things are happening in the global north versus global south and what that looks like, and more connections there. I have other ones where they want to know, well, what can we do? Or, what are the actionable steps we can take? And a lot of it is really just starting with acknowledgement, especially like even the simple things of like, can we just acknowledge that redlining was a thing that negatively impacted Black folks? And then it's like, then there are some folks who want to start talking, oh, well, it wasn't my fault, I wasn't there. It's like, I'm not blaming you. I'm not asking for an apology. What I am asking is for you to acknowledge where we are and how we got here, and to make steps forward so that we don't repeat the same thing. Like, that's what it is. And so it's been a lot of action items. So, because there are some people who they want to know what they can do. And so, but then it's just very case by case, and it depends, and it's so many options. And a lot of it's like, you can go to the Google. Like there are lots of options that I'm not going to be able to teach you right now. Nor is it my job.
You say go to the Google. I was I interviewed Constant Carter, and she did this TEDx, and she calls it GTS. Google that shit.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. Exactly. Like, we have so much information that you can figure this out. Like, you don't need me to spoon feed it to you. And it's like, and sometimes some of those questions, I recognize that they're coming from more of an emotional place. And so I try to acknowledge the emotion, but also let them know that they have the autonomy to go figure this out, and that it is not on me or any other person of color to teach them how to do. Like, I can't teach you why it's important to care about people.
Right. That's,
like,
you either have it or you
right,
don't.
Exactly. And if you don't, then you can go find out. Therapy is a great thing. Like, there are other things to work through. But it's like, 5-minute question.
I got you. First of all, how long have you been an architect?
So I was officially licensed in 2013. So 11 years.
Okay.
And then I graduated grad school in 2010. So it's been a while.
What is some of the challenges that you've had that have transformed your thought process as being an architect?
So I think a lot of it is, I'm trying to think what's a good example. I think the constraints piece of it. So, for instance, there's the building code. And so if the building code varies, and it gets updated every 3 years, but different states adopt building codes at different times. So, for instance, in Maryland right now, we are on the 2021 building code. Working on a project in Kentucky, and they are on the 2015 building code. And it varies differently. But there are, everything is negotiable. And even within the building code, things are negotiable, and particularly when working with historic buildings. And so one of the things that transformed my practice and how I practice is being willing and able to have those conversations with code officials and really arguing why we're trying to do X, Y, or Z, and how this is not going to negatively impact life safety and all of that. So it's recognizing that there is more, there's things that are more negotiable than I thought they were. Kind of like when I was younger, I thought that adults knew what they were doing. I did not realize we are all making this up as we go along. I felt like adults were more adulty back then, but kind of realizing that we all have autonomy to make different decisions and keep questioning things. So that's really impacted how I practice.
Good. So in terms of everything being negotiable, do you find, because now I just got to say this, Nakita, the historical preservation people can be quite...
Oh, I know.
I know. Sometimes I think they should seek therapy.
I know. I mean, therapy is amazing. Everyone should. But and what's also frustrating is that, particularly when you realize that a lot of the people on the commissions, it's political appointments. Some of these people aren't even licensed or trained in preservation. They just like old buildings, or they know the mayor, they know whatever. I remember there was one commission that I had to argue in front of, and it was so frustrating because I was like, listen, I have a master's degree in historic preservation. I know you like old buildings, but what you are asking of me is not actually in compliance with preservation law. And so having to explain that to them in a way that didn't attack their ego, because then they're just going to be defiant anyway, like, well, I'm on the commission, I say no. But yes, I understand that there is a reason why sometimes they are called the hysterical commission. But to their credit, they do also keep a lot of bad things from happening in terms of buildings just being wholesale demolished. So there is a balance, but yes, it is frustrating.
Yeah, it's yeah. And I say that because I remember one time sitting in one of the meetings, and we spent 3 hours talking about windows. Just windows.
Yes.
Just windows.
Yes. Yes, windows are a thing that is very near and dear to the hearts of preservationists.
I was like, okay, this is really deep here.
Yeah, and granted, so we'll talk about windows for just a little bit. But part of it is particularly when you have like old growth wood windows. Those are windows that have been around for like 100 years. And so if you repair those windows, then you will be able to have them for 100 years more. It's going to be much more sustainable to repair historic wood windows than it would be to rip them out and put in the vinyl windows or the replacement windows that the window salesmen always want to put in, or that are faster and easier to put in from just a construction standpoint. but replacement windows is in the name. You're going to have to replace those windows in 20 years. And so a lot of times when talking about windows, the battle is over how can we keep these historic windows that have been here for 100 years, that could be here for 100 more, as opposed to letting them put in some windows that are vinyl that they're going to have to replace in 20 years.
But could they really, I mean, are they really, are they going to be airtight again?
Well, right. So that's the thing where you have to then, that's where the struggle comes in, because the Preservation Commission often does not care about budget. It does, and it can cost more to restore historic wood windows depending upon the quantity and all that. A lot of times you can just put interior or exterior storm windows to improve the thermal quality of the windows, make it more comfortable. But yes, historic wood windows, if they are restored properly, reglazed, resealed, they can be airtight and last longer.
That's a lot of work too.
It can be, particularly if you're using a contractor who is unfamiliar with it. Like there are wood window specialists, and highly recommend those ones. But that is something also that the preservation industry is seeing as a problem, is that a lot of the tradespeople are dying off. Aging out is probably the more sensitive way to say that. But like the apprenticeship program and all that, there is a hole in a lot of the trades professions. And so there are a lot of organizations that are doing things to try and introduce preservation trades to new demographics of people. So to Black and brown people, to people who were formerly incarcerated, to veterans, to all that, to try and get it out of what it used to be of just kind of older white dudes who are only trying to talk to younger white dudes.
So to that point, mm-hmm. So many great craftsmen are aging out, are deceased.
Yes.
And you're seeing it in what's being built. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
And the kids now, carpentry. Are you kidding? That's too laborious. Are you?
Yeah.
I don't have time to be cutting no wood, hitting a hammer. Right. So I wonder. I don't think technology can truly replace it all. Mm-mm. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, granted, there are some companies now that are 3D printing houses, which is interesting. I think it's a way
3D printed houses.
Yes. So they built these giant 3D printers that then go around and actually 3D print the house. And the filament that they're printing, it's actually a thin layer of concrete. And so they're doing like a thin layer of concrete around like the exterior of the walls and whatever. Mm-hmm. And they do the whole house out of that. And so that could work in certain climates. It's not going to work everywhere. Concrete also is not a great material from a carbon emission standpoint. So their technology will keep evolving and seeing what comes out of it. I am still kind of waiting for the big technological disruption that's going to happen in the construction industry, because it hasn't really happened in the past 50 years. We're still kind of building things the way we've been building it since the post-war, post-World War II, stick built, that sort of thing.
Right.
So we'll see. I'm curious what the next intervention and development will be that will change things. If AC was one thing or air conditioning was one thing, I'm curious what the next one will be.
Do you think? So many thoughts moving through my head. So let me start here. So about the pyramids, mm-hmm. and that is totally withstood. Like. Mm-hmm. It seems like nothing else can be built the way the pyramids were built, right? And they, and so I was listening to something recently where they were talking about there had to be machines. Humans didn't build that, right? There had to be machines. So so we fast forward to where we are now here in the 21st century, mm-hmm. It's like, isn't it hard to think like, how can we build without the human input?
Right. And I don't think that we're ever going to build without the human input. Yeah, I think it's always going to be there, whether the human is controlling it like a game controller or doing something else. Like there's always going to have to be a human input at some point in the process. Yeah.
Because when I just think about it, I'm thinking, wow, so robots would be building.
Right. Yeah, they could be, but someone still has to tell the robots what to do. And even from thinking how like AI and all that stuff is evolving. I remember I was at a preservation conference and one of the speakers was saying that preservationists need to be at the table because there needs to be someone who's telling the algorithm and AI what is culturally important and significant into the future. Because that's one of the things I love about preservation, that it really is a present conversation that we're having about our past with our future. So like what from our past do we want to transmit into the future? And so that's kind of the gist of preservation. And how do we sensitively manage change? And so how do we then be mindful of that? And also how do we make sure there's a future to transmit things to? Like from a sustainability standpoint, what are we doing in this time to try and make it easier, or not even make it easier, just make it so that future generations can actually fulfill their own needs without having more of a burden than we have.
Do you think solar will replace everything in terms of?
I'd be surprised if it didn't. One of my friends who's very into solar, he was saying how, money doesn't fall from trees, but it definitely falls from the sky. He's like, we have this amazing resource in the sky that we could leverage better, right? And so I would not be surprised if in 50 years, that generation is looking back on us like, they were dumb. How could they not have solar everywhere? That sort of thing. Or kind of the same way, I feel like sometimes I look back on like 50s and 60s, like they were riding in cars without seatbelts? What? What? So it's just kind of like, I feel like there will be things that people in the future look back on us and be like, they were wild.
Yeah, when I look back at someone, so we had this conversation, I don't know if they're college house, alley house, whatever, the house, those.
Yeah.
And I just thought to myself, was everybody like only 5'2"?
Right.
Right. The ceiling sitting on your head. So I just wonder, we probably won't be here to see it, but
Right, exactly.
You just think about it, you're like, wow. Mm-hmm. So what are you passionate about?
Lots of things. And I think the biggest thing is really connecting. And I keep coming back to it because even if it's from I tend to be the black friend that my white friends want to talk to about race, or the girl that my guy friends want to come to about. I very much am happy to sit in that awkward space of I might put my foot in my mouth, but here we go. I have a lot of friends of different races and religions, and I'm not a mother, but I have friends who are mothers, and I have no problem asking those ridiculous questions where I'm like, but wait a minute, what does that feel like? And so those kinds of things. So I think I'm just really passionate about helping people understand that we are more alike than similar.
We're definitely more alike than.
I feel like it's at the end of the day, people are just people, and it's fun for me to talk about that in a lot of different random settings. Yeah. But
that's really cool because the more diverse you understand other people's perspective, you can really make a better decision for the whole versus just from your own narrow point of view.
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's really cool. Do you want kids?
No.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I don't. And it's interesting because having kids was never something that was top of my bucket list. My mom always jokes, she's like, because my mom had me and my sister when she was very young. Mm-hmm. And so from a very young age, she was like, you need to get your degrees and all that before you even think about having kids. But then she's like, I guess I was pushed that a little bit too hard because me and my sister have kids. But it's one of those things where it was just having kids was never a desire. I had friends who were like, oh, I can't wait to hold babies, blah, blah. I am the most awkward person when it comes to a baby. I'm like, no, I need to sit down before you let me hold this child because I don't want to drop it. I'm very tall. It's going to be weird. I like kids that can control their necks. That's when I can hang out with kids. But, newborns, you know what I mean? I'm the head's just everywhere.
The wobble.
Yeah, exactly.
And it freaks you out.
Exactly, it does. So I will say kids are not something that I've been like, yes, I can't wait. I had friends who were like, oh, I can't wait to be pregnant. And I'm like, why? So short answer, no.
So your husband never wanted kids?
No, and it's one of the things I think both of us were very much if it happens, it happens. But it wasn't a weird trying and let's do IVF and it's just kind of okay, we'll see. Yeah.
So it probably wouldn't be a good time for you guys to have kids now anyway, because you're so used to
it would be we got to do where? It would be an adjustment for sure. But we'll see. I'm open to it, but it's not a priority.
Okay, we'll go back to your first answer. No, I don't.
There we go.
Okay. I got it. I got it. And that's okay.
Yeah,
It really
exactly.
is.
Exactly.
What's prosperity for you?
For me, it's the idea of being able to do what I want, when I want, with whoever I want. So it's like really trying to not have to be tied to a certain job or location or feeling a sense of lack. So it's like really having that autonomy and freedom to be me.
And how close are you to that point of view in your life?
I mean, I'd say maybe 60%.
Okay.
I feel like a big part of it was really getting out of my own way and realizing that I have more autonomy than I realized. For a long time, I feel like I was looking for a lot of that external validation and permission, still working through a lot of my people-pleasing tendencies and realizing, oh, wait, no is a complete sentence.
Very much so.
So it's being like, okay, well then if I want to do this or I don't want to do that. So that was, I think, a big part of it. And so now I'm focused more so on, okay, what about the financial piece of it? What does that look like? Realizing that financial security is very important, but also looks very different. So it's progress, but not quite there yet.
Not quite there.
Yeah.
And so what does life look like for Nakita 5 years from now?
So multimillionaire Nakita at that time will right,
I receive it.
There we go.
I receive it.
So it will still be doing a lot of community development work. Hopefully, being able to invest in a lot of these historic buildings. So yes, being able to think about it from the architecture side, but I'm also realizing that developers like yourself and others who are focused on doing sustainable development, particularly within existing and historic buildings, like that is something that I think there is a huge need for. So I'd love to be involved in more of that and helping more projects and communities have more autonomy over their built environment.
Built by us for us?
But what?
Built by us for us?
Exactly. Exactly.
And building, let's just talk about developer for 1
Sure.
second. A lot of white men. And I had the new ED at Southwest Partnership tell me that the one who has the money has the say, right? So and all of that's true. So, but my question to you is, because I think that sometimes I live in a fantasy land. So my question to you is, you can build back a neighborhood and create the synergy you need to still get a return on investment.
Absolutely.
So why is it, I think this ties into your whole mantra, why is it that they let these dilapidated communities sit for so long?
My guess is that there is an assumption that the land will be worth more in the future when more developers decide they want to come to a spot. A lot of times people don't want to be the first one or the first money into a block.
Pioneer.
Right. Because they're like, well, I'm not going to see my money right now. It's more risky. But it's, I think a lot of times it's that desire to have a guaranteed safe return on your investment if you know you're going into a known thing, as opposed to stepping out and being the first.
But is anything ever guaranteed?
Oh, it's not. But I think kind of the different formulas or the investment rates, the loans that the banks are willing to give, all that sort of thing. I think there's this, just the made up formula of like, oh no, that's a risky area. Right? Like, yeah.
Goes back to the redlining thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. It's a risk area because you
Right.
made it a risk area.
Right, exactly. It's like, oh, I see a black person. It's risky. You can't. Right.
And so I guess the whole thing is to really, in terms of building back community, I think if we learn to build back our own communities,
Right.
and build our own wealth with our own point of view, people will be, they can't just say, well, we're not going to.
Right.
We're not going to mess with that neighborhood, right?
Right.
We have to really take a stand and understand how to build back our own community.
Yeah.
Because if you want 40 acres in the mule, it's so much dilapidation. You can get your 40.
Right, exactly.
You know what I
Right.
mean? It's
Right.
just everywhere.
Yeah, and so
in every major city.
Yeah, and so being able to have more of that mindset of no one's coming to save us. We're the cavalry that we're waiting on, and like what can we do to actually improve what we have?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I truly. So I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that. Do you think? This is an awful question. Do you think? I'm just asking because I think about my things that happen, especially in building back communities. And this gentleman went to Harvard, right? And so I'm having a conversation about it, and he says to me, you know, I understand totally what you said. Now I get it. I'm a black man, and I thought to myself, you wouldn't have to say you were a black man if you were.
Right. It's like I see you.
Why are you telling me you're
Right.
a black man?
Right.
But I think that your environment has a lot to do with your perspective of how you build
Right.
community.
Right. And I think also it has to do with the concept of enough. Because depending upon tax bracket or whatever, like sometimes someone would be like, oh, well, I'm only going to make $5 million on that profit. That's not enough. As opposed to someone be like, oh, I'm going to make $5 million. That's more than enough. So I think it's also relative to what the goals are of the different people putting in the money and what they're looking to get out of it. So that's also, I think, a perspective shift. And so that can be frustrating because like if you're trying to stunt on your country club friends and you're like, oh, I made $5 million, that might not be enough. As opposed to if you're just like, no, I did this thing for the community.
But what, there's other returns like the impact, right?
Right.
The generational wealth that you can have from that.
Yeah.
It's not just the dollar at the
I
end
agree.
of the day.
I agree. But it depends on their perspective of what they're seeing value in. Yeah.
And so my thing is we need to get more developers who see the bigger picture in terms of we have to build back people
Right.
in order to really build back
Right.
community in order to have
Exactly.
these buildings thrive.
Exactly. It's like we're doing all of this for people. And I think sometimes, for whatever reason, architects, developers, like the people aspect of it gets lost.
Yeah, it's like these buildings, these walls have stories to tell, right?
Exactly.
Because the
Exactly.
people,
Right.
they're not alive without people.
Right, exactly.
You just gotta. How about all the empty buildings from Pat? Right. Those buildings don't. That energy isn't there, right? Anymore. So when you build, you should build from that perspective.
exactly.
In my mindset.
Exactly.
So, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to talk about?
I think we touched on it a little bit, but I guess I'll elaborate a little bit more on this idea of permission.
Okay.
Particularly for a lot of women who have people-pleasing tendencies and the idea of, oh, well, let me do this and do that because if I do this or that, then maybe they will like me, not leave me, all the things. But it's kind of like realizing that we have the permission that we need to do what we want and we don't need that external validation. And a lot of times when you're sharing your vision with people and you have to be careful who you share your vision with, you could tell someone, oh, I really have this great idea to do X, Y, and Z. And they could be like, oh, that's dumb, that's not gonna work. But it's like, you are the one that has to believe your vision. And whether or not someone else believes it, that may not be for them. And so it's like you being able to communicate what's in your head, get it out onto paper, to have that conversation, and realize that your vision, you're the one that has to believe it to make it come to fruition. You don't have to get external validation from so many people, particularly at the beginning when you're trying to figure out what that is. I'm not saying that you're going to do it all in a silo. You're definitely going to need people to make your idea come to fruition, but don't be discouraged. Don't look for permission from something that you don't actually need permission on. That's something that I wish I would have really understood when I was younger, and it's something that I'm embracing fully now.
Yeah, that's an amazing point. You're absolutely right. And the funny thing is, those people who usually have something negative to say, they're projecting their own fears on you.
100%.
And I can't even tell you how many people, and they're still telling me, I don't know why you want to be in Baltimore doing what you're doing. I know, but I'm gonna do it anyway.
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? Because at some point, someone has to put the stake in the ground, right?
Right.
And I believe if you're passionate enough and you're strong enough, and there's so many people at least the word on the street is that, there's so many of these companies that have that environmental, social governance money that they want to give to these communities and build them back. So my goal is to make sure you keep that promise.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Let's really test.
Right.
Because the other thoughts that I think in terms of what you're saying is that if we listen to all the reasons why we can't do it, nothing will ever get done.
Exactly. There's always going to be a reason not to do something. It's always.
So I love that you brought that up. And I love the work that you're doing out there, and really opening people, giving them other perspective, because really that's where the genius is, and how many perspectives that you can respect and understand.
Yeah.
So I truly receive that. Thank you again for coming.
Of course.
I don't know if I asked you all the questions, but at the end of the day, I always enjoy you. You
Same.
always teach me something when you come, and I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Of course.
Again, breakthrough to purpose, passion, and prosperity. Thank you. Have a good day.